Hi, and welcome to this Android video on fragments. Fragments were introduced in API 11 as an extension of view group controls. So what is a view group? A view group is a group of controls that can be treated as a single unit in an activity. But a fragment is really a way to have a view group or a group of controls that is a class that can be treated in an object-oriented way. So fragments are similar to view groups, but every fragment is a separate object with its own layout, and these objects are embedded in an activity. Fragments will have their own life cycle, and this life cycle is very similar to the activity's life cycle, and it also depends on the life cycle of the activity that contains them. So the fragment life cycle contains all the activity lifecycle methods on create, on start, on resume, on pause, on stop, and on destroy. These all exist for fragments just like they do for activities. However, there are some more methods that we can get into to control the life cycle of a fragment. OnAttach happens right before onCreate when the fragment is attached to the activity. In other words, when the activity puts the fragment onto itself, OnAttach on that fragment object is called. OnCreateView and OnActivityCreated are called between OnCreate and OnStart in that normal activity lifecycle. Now, the most important lifecycle method of a fragment is OnCreateView, because OnCreateView registers the fragment with the activity, and we'll get into that in the next slide. Similarly, OnDestroyView is called after OnStop and before OnDestroy on the fragment. And then finally, after OnDestroy, the fragment is detached from its activity, and OnDetach is called. So the three most important fragment lifecycle methods are OnCreate, OnCreateView, and OnPause. Now, OnCreate is where we would initialize any properties of the fragment that would need to be retained over pausing or stopping that fragment. OnCreateView, as I already said, is probably the most important one, because OnCreateView must return the root view, of the layout of the fragment. So the fragment has its own layout. That layout has a root view. Now, whether that view is a view group or some sort of linear or relative or absolute layout even, we must return the root view of the fragment. So OnCreateView has to return that, and therefore OnCreateView is always overridden when we write a fragment. And then finally, OnPause, we would save property state for the fragment in OnPause. Now, this is very important, because if the activity that holds a fragment is destroyed, then the fragment state won't be saved by default. So we don't know when we pause a fragment if that activity is going to go away the next time, before the next time the fragment comes up, or what. So we need to save state. If we need to save state, we need to do it in OnPause for the fragment, because the underlying activity isn't a safe place to save state for a fragment. Save it in the fragment class rather than the activities class itself. So fragments really are classes. They are defined as subclasses of class fragment in the Android API. Every fragment has its own layout XML file. And then in the main activities XML, when we're creating the application, in the main activities XML, we drag a fragment from the palette out to the interface, and then we define the class upon which that fragment is based. After we drag it out, we get a pop-up dialog, and then we're asked for the class of the fragment. At that point, the activity has access to both the fragment's ID and any IDs of the fragment's controls. And it has You might expect that this ID would be hierarchical, but it's not. Both the fragment and the IDs of the fragment's controls are at the same level in R.java. And this gives us a very, very neat way to control both the fragments and the subcontrols within the fragments view. So let's talk a little bit about fragments and R.java. Any fragment or control within a fragment that lists an Android ID attribute is going to be added to R.id within R.java. And then all control IDs for an activity are at the same level, whether they're in a fragment or not. So we don't have to drill down within the activity. We don't have to say, okay, give me the fragment ID, okay, now give me the ID for this control within that fragment. This means that the IDs within fragments should be unique because we don't have a hierarchical way to go down and drill down within our fragments. So we need to make sure that the ID strings that we define in the layouts are unique across the activities that use these. When we apply IDs to fragments, this allows the activity to treat the fragment view as a whole unit, and we can show and hide the entire fragment, and that'll show or hide all the views within the controls. If we want to, that'll show all or hide all the controls within the views. If we want to, let's say, drag the whole fragment around with drag and drop, we can do that, and that'll drag all the controls within the fragment. And so this gives us a really nice way, even though the hierarchy is flat for all of these IDs in R.ig within R.java, we can still get the ID of the fragment as a whole and treat it as a whole for showing and hiding the fragment, and that'll show and hide all of its controls and so forth. But remember that all of these IDs are at the same hierarchical level in the RID class, and in the demo we'll look at this. Okay, thank you very much.